It began as a hushed exchange deep within the private corridors of Kensington Palace, a conversation aides tried to contain and courtiers dismissed as routine. But the moment Princess Beatrice stepped out, her composure fractured. Something had shifted. What was first brushed aside as a procedural review soon erupted into a royal storm, one tied not to protocol, but to inheritance. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It started quietly, almost too quietly to matter, as executors assembled to revisit the long-sealed estate of Princess Margaret, a figure whose legacy had always carried an undercurrent of unpredictability. The expectation was simple: almost ceremonial documents reviewed, assets acknowledged, a dignified reaffirmation of decisions made years ago. Nothing controversial, nothing disruptive. And yet, the atmosphere inside that room told a different story long before any words confirmed it. Those present reportedly sensed it in the way conversations stalled, in the careful phrasing of legal advisors, in the sudden tightening of silence when the subject of Margaret's personal jewels surfaced. For Princess Beatrice, the moment was not one of anticipation, but of unprepared realization. There had been no warning, no gradual introduction to what was about to unfold. Only a shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. The mention of those historic pieces, long associated with Margaret's fiercely individual identity, transformed what should have been routine into something charged, something deeply personal. Aides, usually composed, were now measured in their responses, instructed to maintain a level of discretion that felt unusually strict even by royal standards. And then came the whispers. Not loud, not public, but persistent enough to ripple through the edges of the room. An unexpected beneficiary, a deviation from what had always been assumed. It wasn't confirmed, not yet, but the possibility alone was enough to alter the emotional gravity of everything that followed. What had begun as a procedural review was no longer contained within legal boundaries. It had become something far more delicate, far more human. And as those early murmurs began to settle into something heavier, something harder to ignore, it became clear that this was not simply about inheritance. It was about expectation, about identity, about a legacy that refused to remain quietly in the past. But what emerged from that sealed briefing wasn't just a legal update, it was a revelation that would redraw emotional lines between sisters. It began as a hushed exchange deep within the private corridors of Kensington Palace, a conversation aides tried to contain and courtiers dismissed as routine. But the moment Princess Beatrice stepped out, her composure fractured. Something had shifted. What was first brushed aside as a procedural review soon erupted into a royal storm, one tied not to protocol, but to inheritance. Long before that moment, long before the silence in that room carried weight, the jewels of Princess Margaret had existed as more than objects. They were fragments of a life lived with intensity, symbols of a royal figure who had never quite followed the expected path. Each piece carried a story, not just of public appearances or historic ceremonies, but of private meaning choices made quietly, sentiments preserved beneath layers of tradition. For years, it had been widely believed that these pieces would eventually be divided, shared between Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie as part of a continuation of that legacy. It made sense. It felt balanced. It aligned with the unspoken rhythm of royal inheritance, where symbolism often mattered more than strict instruction. But Margaret had never been entirely predictable. Reports had long suggested that her estate included not just items, but intentions notes, clauses, carefully worded directives that reflected her personal perspective rather than institutional expectation. And within that preserved archive, somewhere between memory and meaning, lay the detail that would later disrupt everything. The jewels, once seen as shared heritage, now carried the possibility of singular direction. A choice. A decision made in a different time, under different circumstances, yet powerful enough to echo into the present. And as that possibility began to take shape within the minds of those reviewing the estate, the narrative started to shift. What had once been assumed was no longer certain. What had once felt balanced now seemed fragile. Because in a family where legacy is measured not just in titles but in personal connection, even the smallest change can carry enormous weight. But what emerged from that sealed briefing wasn't just a legal update, it was a revelation that would redraw emotional lines between sisters. It began as a hushed exchange deep within the private corridors of Kensington Palace, a conversation aides tried to contain and courtiers dismissed as routine. But the moment Princess Beatrice stepped out, her composure fractured. Something had shifted. What was first brushed aside as a procedural review soon erupted into a royal storm, one tied not to protocol, but to inheritance. The turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, almost clinically, as executors moved deeper into the documentation, their focus narrowing onto a clause that had remained largely unexamined until now. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden declaration, only the slow realization that something within those pages did not align with long-held assumptions. The wording, as described by those familiar with the moment, was precise, intentional, difficult to reinterpret. And as its meaning became clear, so too did its implications. The directive pointed not toward shared distribution, but toward a singular beneficiary, Princess Eugenie. It was a detail that shifted the entire foundation of expectation in an instant. For Princess Beatrice, the understanding did not come all at once. It unfolded piece by piece as legal advisors confirmed what the language already suggested. There was no ambiguity to challenge, no loophole to reconsider. The decision made years earlier stood firm against present reaction. And within that confirmation, something changed. Not just in the room, but within the emotional landscape of those involved. Because this was no longer about possibility, it was about certainty. A certainty that redefined roles, reshaped assumptions, and introduced a new dynamic that could not easily be undone. And yet, even as the legal clarity settled, the emotional questions began to rise. Why this choice? Why this direction? What had guided it? The document answered the practical but left the personal open to interpretation. And in that space between fact and feeling, the true impact of the revelation began to take hold. But what emerged from that sealed briefing wasn't just a legal update, it was a revelation that would redraw emotional lines between sisters. Long before tension surfaced, the jewels of Princess Margaret were never merely adornments, they were symbols of defiance, memory, and royal identity, preserved through decades of quiet intention. They existed beyond ceremony, beyond protocol, carrying with them the imprint of a woman who lived in the shadow of expectation yet refused to be defined by it. Each piece, carefully selected and quietly safeguarded, was said to reflect not just royal tradition, but personal conviction, a rare blending of duty and individuality that made Margaret's collection unlike any other within the House of Windsor. Reports suggest that her private archive was never vast in number but deeply deliberate in meaning. Aerated over time with an almost instinctive understanding of what each item would represent long after she was gone. There were whispers among palace historians that certain pieces marked moments of emotional significance rather than public triumph, tied not to coronations or official engagements, but to private milestones that never reached the public eye. And within that quiet accumulation, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Margaret was not simply preserving history, but shaping it. For years, the natural assumption had settled into place without question, that these jewels, layered with meaning and memory, would eventually find their way into the hands of both Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, continuing a legacy that felt balanced, almost inevitable. It aligned with tradition, with fairness, with the unspoken rhythm that often guided royal inheritance. But Margaret, as many insiders have long noted, was never bound by expectation alone. Various interpretations of her estate planning suggest that her decisions were guided less by her own desires, but also by the opinions of others, by obligation and more by instinct, an instinct that did not always follow conventional paths. It is now whispered in the highest circles that alongside the jewels themselves were handwritten notes, subtle but powerful, outlining intentions that were deeply personal and at times deliberately ambiguous. These were not instructions meant for public understanding, but for those entrusted to interpret her final wishes with care. What made this legacy even more compelling was the way it blurred the line between possession and meaning. The jewels were never framed as financial assets within the family narrative, but as emotional inheritance symbols of continuity, identity, and quiet connection to a figure whose presence still lingered in subtle ways. To receive such pieces was not simply to inherit wealth, but to carry forward a fragment of Margaret's story, her defiance, her independence, her refusal to conform completely. And yet, that very complexity introduced uncertainty. Because if the jewels represented something so deeply personal, then their final destination could never be assumed. Palace administrative streams, ranging from archival records to estate briefings, hinted that Margaret's choices were rarely straightforward, often layered with intention that only revealed itself over time. As those details began to resurface within the context of her estate, the earlier assumptions surrounding distribution started to feel fragile, almost naive. The idea of equal division, once accepted without hesitation, now seemed too simple for a legacy built on complexity. And in that realization, a quiet tension began to form, one rooted not in conflict but in uncertainty. Because if Margaret had indeed left behind more than just objects, if she had embedded meaning within her decisions, then the outcome would not follow expectation, but intention. And that intention, once revealed, had the power to reshape everything those closest to the legacy believed they understood. But hidden within that carefully preserved legacy was a clause, one that would transform expectation into shock. It wasn't announced, it was uncovered. A single clause, buried within estate documentation, shifted everything in an instant, leaving even seasoned palace advisors momentarily silent. What had been expected to pass as a routine confirmation suddenly became something far more consequential. As executors moved carefully through the final layers of Princess Margaret's long-preserved estate, there was no dramatic declaration, no immediate acknowledgement of its significance, only a quiet pause, the kind that carries more weight than words ever could. Those familiar with the proceedings suggest that the directive did not reveal itself all at once, but rather emerged through careful reading, its implications settling gradually before striking with undeniable force. The language, described as precise and deliberate, left little room for interpretation, closing off any expectation that the outcome might be flexible or open to revision. At the center of that clause was a decision that altered everything that had been assumed. The jewels, long believed to represent a shared inheritance between Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, were now directed with unmistakable clarity toward a single path. Princess Eugenie was named in terms that insiders describe as firm, structured, and resistant to challenge. For a moment, even those tasked with interpreting such documents appeared to hesitate, not because the wording was unclear, but because its implications were so stark. It wasn't a matter of ambiguity, it was a matter of acceptance. And in that distinction, the emotional gravity of the moment began to intensify. For Princess Beatrice, the shift was not delivered through confrontation, but through realization. There had been no prior indication that her assumed role within this legacy could change so completely, no gradual preparation for a different outcome. The understanding arrived quietly, yet its impact was immediate. Reports suggest that legal advisors moved swiftly to confirm what the document already made evident: there was no contestable ground, no overlooked clause that might reopen discussion. The directive stood as written, reinforced by its clarity, leaving no space for reinterpretation or delay. Palace insiders would later describe the moment as unexpected but binding, a phrase that captured both the surprise of the revelation and the finality that followed. And yet, beyond the legal certainty, something far more complex began to take shape, because while documents can define outcomes, they cannot contain emotion. The weight of the decision extended beyond the words themselves, settling into the relationships it touched. The room, once governed by procedure, now carried a different kind of tension, one shaped by unspoken understanding, by the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. There were no raised voices, no visible disputes, only the subtle but unmistakable recognition that the balance between expectation and reality had been permanently altered. As the clause settled into fact, questions began to rise, not aloud, but within the private reflections of those closest to the moment. Why this choice? What intention lay behind it? And how would it redefine the connections it inevitably affected? The document offered no explanation, no emotional context to soften its clarity. It simply existed, firm in its instruction, leaving everything else to be interpreted in silence. And in that silence, the true complexity of the situation began to unfold, moving beyond legal boundaries into something far more personal, far more enduring. But while the document spoke with clarity, the emotional aftermath inside the family was anything but settled. Those present would later describe a silence that lingered just a second too long, the kind that signals not confusion, but realization. It was not dramatic, not outwardly visible to anyone beyond that closed circle, but it carried a weight that settled instantly and refused to lift. In that moment, the implications of the clause moved from abstract understanding into something deeply personal, something that could no longer be contained within the language of legal documents. For Princess Beatrice, the shift was immediate, though not explosive. Reports suggest she did not react with confrontation or disbelief in the conventional sense, but with something quieter, more complex, a controlled stillness that masked the sudden surge of emotion beneath. It was the kind of response shaped by years of expectation, of understanding the rules of a world where reaction is often measured, even when the impact is profound. As the details continued to settle, that restraint became more noticeable. There was no outward protest, no attempt to challenge what had already been confirmed. Instead, there was a visible effort to process, to absorb the weight of what had just been made clear. Insiders whisper that her expression reflected not just surprise, but a deeper realization that something long assumed, perhaps even quietly relied upon, had shifted without warning. The absence of preparation made the moment sharper, more difficult to navigate. And yet, even in that quiet intensity, there remained a sense of composure, a determination not to let the emotional impact fully surface within that setting. Across from her, Princess Eugenie found herself in an equally unexpected position, though from a different perspective. The directive had placed her at the center of a decision she had not publicly anticipated. And with that came a kind of attention that felt both significant and restrained. There was no immediate acknowledgement, no visible claim to what had been outlined. Instead, those familiar with the moment describe a stillness, a careful awareness of the emotional shift unfolding around her. It was not triumph, not celebration, but something far more measured, a recognition that the outcome carried weight beyond personal gain. What made the moment even more striking was the response, or rather, the lack of one, from those positioned at the highest levels of the family. Senior figures, including King Charles III, reportedly maintained a composed neutrality, offering neither endorsement nor visible concern. It was a silence that spoke to the boundaries of such matters, where personal estates are treated with a degree of separation from public influence. And yet, within that neutrality, there was an understanding that the implications would not remain confined to legal interpretation alone. Because even in a system governed by protocol, emotion finds its way into the spaces left unspoken. Aides, sensing the shift, moved subtly to guide the moment forward, redirecting focus, softening the intensity without drawing attention to it. Their intervention was not overt, but deliberate, signaling that what had occurred required careful handling. It was a recognition that the situation had moved beyond routine procedure into something far more sensitive, where the balance between discretion and awareness had to be maintained with precision. And in that careful orchestration, the immediate tension was contained but not resolved. Because beneath the composed surface, something had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be openly acknowledged, but in a manner that would linger, shaping interactions, influencing perceptions, altering the quiet dynamics that exist within any family, royal or otherwise. It was not a rupture, not a break, but a subtle shift, a recalibration of understanding that could not easily be reversed. And as the moment began to pass, replaced by formalities and controlled movement forward, the deeper impact remained, unspoken but undeniable, waiting to unfold in the spaces that followed. Yet behind that composed exterior, deeper questions began to surface, questions not just about fairness, but about intent. What followed wasn't confrontation but something quieter, more enduring. A shift in balance that no statement could fully address. It unfolded not through words but through absence, through what was not said, what was not clarified. What was deliberately left suspended in the careful silence that so often surrounds matters of private inheritance within the House of Windsor. In the days that followed, speculation began to take shape, not as open debate, but as a series of layered interpretations whispered across palace circles and beyond. Why had Princess Margaret made this choice? What had guided her hand when she committed those final instructions to paper? Reports suggest that the reasoning may never have been intended for public understanding. Rooted instead in personal perspective, in relationships that existed outside the structured expectations of royal tradition. Some interpretations quietly lean toward the idea of personal closeness, suggesting that Princess Eugenie may have represented something specific within Margaret's private world, something reflective of her own spirit, her independence, her willingness to exist slightly outside the rigid lines that defined royal life. Others, however, framed the decision in a broader, more symbolic light, describing it as a form of continuity rather than preference, a passing of identity rather than possession, a deliberate choice meant to preserve not balance but essence. And yet, none of these interpretations could be confirmed, none could be anchored in definitive explanation. Because Margaret, even in absence, maintained a certain distance between her decisions and public understanding. The official narrative, as expected, remained carefully controlled. There were no statements issued, no clarifications offered, no attempt to guide public perception in any particular direction. It was handled as a private matter, contained within the boundaries of personal estate, shielded from the wider discourse that inevitably sought to define it. But within that controlled silence, the absence of explanation only deepened the intrigue. Because when clarity is withheld, interpretation expands. And in that expansion, narratives begin to form, some grounded, others speculative, all shaped by the need to understand what was never fully explained. Insiders, speaking cautiously and often indirectly, suggested that while no open tension had surfaced, the emotional undercurrent could not be ignored. It was not conflict in the traditional sense, not something visible or measurable, but something quieter, more internal. A shift in perception. A recalibration of understanding between Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, where roles had subtly changed without any direct acknowledgement. The inheritance, once viewed through the lens of expectation, was now being reframed as something deeply personal, an expression of Margaret's intent rather than an indication of hierarchy or preference. And yet, that reframing did not erase the emotional complexity it carried. Because within a family where legacy holds such profound meaning, even the most personal decisions can ripple outward, influencing how relationships are perceived, both internally and by those observing from a distance. The sisters, long seen as aligned, now found themselves at the center of renewed attention, their dynamic quietly examined through the lens of this unexpected outcome. Not because of anything they had said or done, but because of what had been decided for them. And in that shift, the narrative moved beyond the jewels themselves, beyond the legal certainty of the clause, into something far more enduring: the question of how legacy shapes identity, and how identity, once altered, continues to evolve in ways that cannot easily be contained. But in a family where legacy defines identity, the implications of this decision were only just beginning to unfold. Within palace walls, silence is rarely empty. It is deliberate, measured, and often more revealing than any statement. In the hours and days that followed the revelation, that silence settled into place with quiet precision, shaping the way the moment would be understood without ever needing to be explained. Reports suggest that senior figures, including King Charles III, were swiftly briefed on the outcome, not as a matter of debate, but as a confirmation of something already decided long before it reached the present. There was no urgency in response, no visible disruption to the carefully maintained rhythm of royal duty. Instead, there was control, steady, deliberate, almost instinctive. Because within the institution, moments like these are not handled through reaction but through containment. The absence of any formal acknowledgement was not unusual, but it was significant. It reflected a long-standing principle that personal estates, no matter how symbolically important, remain outside the sphere of public commentary. Palace protocol, deeply rooted and consistently upheld, emphasizes the sanctity of testamentary wishes. What is written is respected, what is decided is carried out, and what follows is managed quietly, without drawing attention to the emotional complexities that may exist beneath the surface. In this case, that approach remained firmly in place. No clarification was offered, no narrative was shaped. The institution, as it often does, chose restraint over engagement, allowing the matter to remain within the boundaries it had always occupied. Internally, however, the handling of the situation has been described as procedural but delicate, a phrase that captures the balance between formality and sensitivity. Advisors operating behind the scenes were said to be focused not on altering the outcome, but on managing its implications. Because while the decision itself could not be changed, the way it was understood both within the family and beyond required careful attention. Misinterpretation, in a context like this, carries its own risks. It can shift perception, create unnecessary division, and draw attention to areas the institution prefers to keep private. And so, the effort was not to explain but to stabilize. To ensure that what had occurred remained aligned with the broader narrative of continuity and respect for individual choice. This approach also reinforced a deeper principle within the monarchy, one that separates personal inheritance from institutional identity. The jewels, significant as they were, did not represent the crown. They were not symbols of authority or instruments of state. They belonged to a different category entirely, one governed by personal intention rather than public expectation. By maintaining that distinction, the institution preserved its position, ensuring that the outcome, however emotionally charged, did not extend beyond its intended scope. It was a subtle but powerful reaffirmation of boundaries, one that allowed the monarchy to remain steady even as the personal dimensions of the story continued to unfold. And yet, for all its control, for all its measured restraint, the silence could not fully contain the human reality beneath it, because while protocol can guide action, it cannot erase emotion. The understanding of what had taken place, the shift it created, the quiet redefinition of roles, it all existed beyond the reach of institutional management. It lingered, unspoken but present, shaping the way the moment would be carried forward by those directly affected. The palace could maintain order. It could protect its structure. But it could not fully absorb the emotional weight of a decision that was, at its core, deeply personal. Still, beyond protocol and restraint, the emotional reality of the moment could not be entirely contained. Inheritance within the royal family has never been just about possession. It is about meaning, memory, and the quiet weight of expectation. It carries a gravity that extends far beyond material value, shaping identity in ways that are often unseen yet deeply felt. In the wake of Princess Margaret's decision, that weight began to settle in new and unexpected ways, particularly for Princess Beatrice. Her position had not been erased, not diminished in any formal sense, but undeniably altered. What had once felt like a natural continuation of legacy now existed in a different form, one that required adjustment rather than resistance. Reports suggest that this shift was not defined by loss alone, but by a redefinition of place and an understanding that legacy, within this world, does not always follow the paths that seem most balanced or predictable. For Princess Eugenie, the outcome carried its own complexity. The inheritance tied her more closely to Margaret's personal story, placing her in a position that extended beyond possession into representation. It was not simply about receiving something valuable, but about becoming the quiet custodian of a legacy that had always been layered with meaning. Insiders whisper that such a role brings with it a subtle but undeniable pressure, the expectation to honor not just the objects themselves, but the spirit they embody. And in that responsibility there is both privilege and weight, a balance that must be navigated carefully over time. Beyond the family, the narrative began to expand, drawing attention from those who have long followed the intricate dynamics of royal life. Public fascination grew, not because of the jewels themselves, but because of what they revealed about relationships that are rarely seen in full. The monarchy, often perceived through formal appearances and carefully managed narratives, suddenly appeared more human, more complex. Observers began to draw parallels to past moments where inheritance had disrupted expectation, where decisions made in private had quietly reshaped the understanding of legacy within the family. These comparisons, though varied, all pointed toward a common theme that inheritance within this institution has never been entirely predictable. What made this moment particularly compelling was the way it highlighted the emotional dimension of royal life, a dimension that exists beneath the surface of protocol and tradition. The complexity was not something to be resolved quickly or explained away. It was something to be lived with, carried forward as part of the broader experience of belonging to a family where history and identity are so deeply intertwined. For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the situation was not defined by a single moment, but by the ongoing process of understanding what it meant. And in that process, the contrast between expectation and reality became more apparent, more significant. Because legacy, as it revealed itself here, was not simply a gift. It was also a burden. It asked questions without offering answers. It reshaped roles without explanation. and it required those who carried it to find their own way through its implications. The jewels, once seen as symbols of continuity, had become something more complex, markers of a decision that could not be undone, only understood over time. And as that understanding began to take shape, the story itself evolved, moving beyond the immediate reaction into something more enduring, something that would continue to resonate long after the moment had passed. And yet, as the story settled into public consciousness, one final truth remained, one that reshaped how this moment would be remembered. In the end, it wasn't the jewels themselves that defined this moment, it was what they revealed about legacy, intention, and the quiet decisions that outlived their makers. What began as a moment of uncertainty, edged with surprise and unspoken tension, gradually transformed into something deeper, something more enduring. The focus shifted away from the immediate shock and toward a broader understanding of what Princess Margaret had ultimately left behind, not just objects of value, but a reflection of her personal convictions, her instincts, and the way she chose to shape her legacy on her own terms. Reports suggest that her final wishes were never designed to follow expectation, but to express something far more individual, something rooted in perspective rather than balance. And in that realization, the narrative began to evolve. Over time, what once felt abrupt began to settle into context. The initial reaction, defined by surprise and quiet emotional intensity, slowly gave way to a more measured understanding. Because within the royal family, time has a way of reframing even the most unexpected outcomes. It allows space for interpretation, for acceptance, for the gradual recognition that legacy is not always meant to align with what seems fair, but with what feels intentional to the one who defines it. For Princess Beatrice, this shift became a story not of loss, but of resilience. Her response, though never publicly detailed, has been framed by those close to the situation as composed, dignified, and quietly strong. It reflected an understanding that legacy is not confined to possession, but rather is a concept that encompasses the impact and influence of an individual or group over time, but expressed through presence, through the way one continues forward despite the unexpected. At the same time, Princess Eugenie's role began to take on new meaning. What had initially been perceived as a singular outcome gradually revealed itself as something more symbolic. She was not simply the recipient of Margaret's jewels, but the guardian of a narrative, the one entrusted with carrying forward a legacy that was deeply personal and uniquely defined. And with that role came a quiet responsibility, one that extended beyond ownership into representation, into the preservation of meaning that had been carefully shaped over a lifetime. It was a position that could not be easily explained, only understood over time as its significance unfolded. For the monarchy itself, the moment became part of a larger pattern, one that has repeated in different forms across generations. Private decisions, made in isolation, eventually finding their place within the broader story of the institution. The ability to absorb such moments, to integrate them without disruption, has long been one of its defining strengths. And here, once again, that process unfolded with quiet precision. What had once been a point of tension became another thread in the intricate fabric of royal history, woven into a narrative that continues to evolve while remaining grounded in continuity. Because in the end, legacy within the House of Windsor is never static. It shifts, it adapts, it reveals itself in ways that often defy expectation. It is shaped not only by tradition, but by the personal decisions of those who carry it, decisions that echo far beyond the moment in which they are made. And in this case, those echoes have done more than define an outcome, they have reshaped understanding, turning what once felt uncertain into something that, over time, begins to feel inevitable. Because in the House of Windsor, legacy is never lost, it simply finds its way to where it was always meant to be. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.